Hi. Well, I've set my computer in a little different spot here today just to give you a little different view, and hopefully it's something that works for you. We'll see how it goes. Anyway, it's great to be here, and welcome to Friday, and hope you're enjoying reading through the Psalms, and we have a number of them here today. And the one I want to focus on is Psalm 75, but before we get to that, I wanted to let you know a little story, and it has to do with our children. And reading this psalm kind of made me think about it a little bit. And it goes back to when our kids were smaller, and Brent was actually a little kid at that time, and we used to leave Heather home to babysit him. Heather did such a good job. She was such a conscientious child, and still is today as an adult. And she would entertain him and play with him and feed him, and at times attempt to discipline him. Now, it was at those times when he was doing something he ought not to be doing, and she was asking him to stop it, that he used to turn to her and say, "You're not the boss of me." And certainly it would exasperate her, and she would call us, usually her mom, to try to get him to behave. But I thought, how appropriate, it addresses this psalm perfectly, because the reality is, I think that very phrase is certainly at the heart of one of the basic problems of the human race ever since the fall. And that is, we don't like to be underneath anyone. We like to be the boss. And unfortunately, the truth is, as the psalmist points out here, God is the boss and we are not. Now, the psalm is actually attributed to Asaph, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really necessarily apply to any specific battle or any situation, and it really doesn't have to, because it kind of applies across the board to mankind throughout history. And it's our sin nature at its core that is selfish. We want to be in charge, and we don't want anyone telling us what to do. We also want what we want when we want it. And that is the problem. And the psalmist begins here in verse 1 by offering a word of praise and thanksgiving to God and lifting God up as the one who is in charge. And he speaks about the wondrous works of God, the things God has done. And my first thought is, yes, God has done marvelous things. We already in our readings have been privy to quite a few of them. Whether it's parting the Red Sea, raising the dead, defeating whole armies, healing the sick, changing water into wine, rising on the third day. The list goes on and on as we go through all of the scriptures. He does all of those things according to his plan and his purpose and his timetable. And he does not act on our whims or our desires or according to our plans. And that is at the crux of things. He's not a God who is here at our beck and call to pull off the shelf whenever we need him. Paul says, or Luke says in Acts 1 verse 7, "It is not for you to know the times or the seasons with which the Father has put in his own authority." God states that very clearly here in verses 2 through 5 of the psalm. He is the one who's in charge. Point out some of the things that speak to that. It says here, "I choose the appointed time. I who judge uprightly. I hold its pillars firm." And then he warns us that be careful. Be careful not to boast. Be careful not to be wicked, but to remember that he is the one who is in charge. I admit, I have a problem with that. I don't know about you. And I'll even admit that even after over 30 years of marriage to my lovely wife, Pam, there are times I still get upset when she tells me to do some things, and I don't like to be bossed. That's just the way we are. I used to think I was getting over that, but sometimes the emotions get in the way or the situation, and I get selfish again. And I think that's pretty true of a lot of us. God says he will choose the time. He is the one in charge. He will judge. And he also warns in verse 5, "Do not lift your horns against heaven and do not speak with outstretched neck." The horns or the horns of power refers to weapons or power that people may possess. And he's warning not to lift them up and try to exalt yourself in your power, or he will cut you off. Now, we are best served by doing something else. And the succeeding verses in Psalm 75, starting with verse 6 through verse 9, speak to that. It would be much better, the psalmist says, were we to spend time meditating upon what God has done, upon God's words. In other words, spend time worshiping Him and listening when He speaks and waiting for Him to act, and get rid of all the distractions and the personal desires that go on in our lives and focus only on Him. Now, that's certainly easier said than done, but nonetheless, it at least gives us something to do that will be much more valuable than trying to make God act like a puppet on our strings. And God does say down here, and I believe it is in verse 8, "In the hand of the Lord is a cup full of foaming wine mixed with spices. He pours it out, and all the wicked of the earth drink it down to its very dregs." God is the judge. Everything will occur according to His timing. He has the wine already mixed. He has all of time taken care of, and it will all be poured out, and everyone will drink of it fully in its time. So that becomes very true in our lives, and we need not demand that God act according to our plans, but rather focus on what He has done. Now, finally, in verse 10, God has the last word, and that seems appropriate. He speaks, really this does speak of the end times, and He says, "I will cut off the horns of all the wicked, but the horns of the righteous will be lifted up." And there are really only two options here as God resolves everything. Either we are the righteous who are exalted, or we are the wicked who are cut off. And the reality is we immediately then turn to the one who, on our behalf, died for our sins and rose again, and that's Jesus Christ. We find the fulfillment and all that is needed to survive God's final judgment in Jesus Christ. And as I said earlier, the psalm opens with a praise and thanksgiving for all the wonderful deeds of God. And for us, sometimes we may look around and say, well, I don't really see God doing all those marvelous things on a daily basis. And the truth is, for us, we look to His Word. We look back to what He has done in Jesus Christ. And when we worship, we look to what God does in the waters of baptism and in the Lord's Supper, where His Son interceded on our behalf and did what we could not do. We look to all the mighty acts of Jesus and all the promises that they fulfilled and the hope that it brings. And that becomes our way of looking at all of God's marvelous deeds, even as we celebrate those times in our lives where God does act and acts according to His plan. And so we give thanks to Him, as the psalmist says. We worship Him, and we trust that all things are in His hands. And hopefully, in doing so, we'll get caught up less and less in the need to be the boss. And I pray that's true for me today, and I pray that be true for you as well. God's blessings.